Today, we are continuing our series, You Don't Know My Name, where we have been looking at the different stories of nameless women in the Gospels. Today, we look at a new woman with a different social location than that of our last two stories. Today, we are going to look at the story of Pilate's wife. Her husband, Pontius Pilate, was the prefect or governor of Judea, responsible for the judgment and trial of Jesus Christ. Most of us are familiar with him and his role in Jesus' story. But as Jesus was taken into Pilate's residence during the earliest hours of the morning, his wife could have potentially been sleeping nearby in the same house, the house of the Roman prefect of Judea. While Pilate is awoken to judge this supposed criminal, she, however, will instead be awoken by the throes of a dream, with her own judgment for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Pilate is mentioned by name and position in Scripture, and it is one of those few times that we have enough mentions of this person outside of the Bible to give weight to the confirmation of Pilate's historical existence. But if Pontius Pilate was presumably someone from recorded history, then potentially his wife's name might have been known as well. Yet her name is not important to the gospel author. She gets reduced to being known by the name of her husband, as many women in Scripture are. To be truthful about today's message, a lot will be imagined through conjecture, interpretation, and imagination, which is something the Bible often does itself. Can we say for sure that Pilate was married? No, not really. The word translated as wife can also be interpreted as Pilate's woman. Most of this account from Matthew's Gospel seems to extend from the Gospel of Mark, but one of the few changes Matthew makes from the Mark account is this inclusion of Pilate's wife and her dream. This, as well as Pilate washing his hands after the trial of Jesus, which seems to be related to his wife's warning to have nothing to do with Jesus Christ at all. But his inclusion of Pilate's wife, Matthew's inclusion, only goes so far as one sentence, and none of the other Gospels mention her either. However, the story of Pilate's wife is further expanded upon in outer biblical writings and early church history. Her story caught the eye of some writers in the early church to the point where she became a sacred figure to some traditions. So why was her small story added? Though it would all be conjecture, we can imagine that a virtuous woman with proximity to power might be a compelling character for an ancient audience. Also, in this ancient world, dreams were commonly seen as divine communication. God or gods would have spoken to their human patrons in dreams, often prophecies, to offer warning or blessing. We see this in Scripture, in the Old Testament and New, and it is something the Roman world and Jewish world would have been familiar with, especially since people in power were seen as having special connection to the divine in their political positions. Pilate's wife's dream happens in a world where dreams are an accepted method of divine communication, both in the Jewish and Greco-Roman world. Matthew itself uses dreams as an unquestionable method of guidance and communication from God. This happens in the stories of Jesus as a child and infant multiple times. These dreams are given in order to protect the life of Jesus Christ. So it makes sense for the author of Matthew to highlight a dream like this as Jesus goes to trial. On top of this, Matthew also seems to recognize the role of women, not only in the ministry of Jesus, but the ministry to Jesus. Later on in Matthew 27, we see that many women were present with Jesus as he hung in the air, crucified. Matthew 27:55 says, "Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him." They did not leave at Jesus' darkest moments, but stayed attentive to his suffering. Even in Matthew 28, after Jesus dies, the two Marys go to see Jesus' tomb to tend to it. As a result, they also get to encounter a divine messenger speaking to them of the status of Jesus as proof of his identity, similar to Pilate's wife. And later, both Marys get to be the first to encounter the resurrected Jesus himself. It is interesting that at this crucial moment in Jesus' life, God's messengers and revelation are appearing to the women in the story. Another interesting thing to note is that this time, the dream is received from someone outside of the Jewish community, from the side of the oppressor. Yes, there are times where women with privilege in our world, whether racial or class privilege, use their status to harm the oppressed and innocent by looking to their own advantage and self-interest. Sometimes, the tears and accusations of privileged women perpetuate violent and oppressive systems. I want to make sure I don't pretend that Pilate's wife does not have some privilege in an oppressive empire, and that her type of power might trigger painful memories for some communities. You can be oppressed and an oppressor at the same time. But ultimately, it is this patriarchal system of fragile and toxic masculinity that creates the violent and oppressive system in the first place. And it is this system that kills Jesus. This system chooses to ignore the voice of a woman who uses her status to say, "This man is righteous." Though Pilate's wife has proximity to power, she does not have any decision-making power. She cannot release Jesus or declare him to be officially innocent. She can only send word to her husband, not even able to use her own voice, and share her experience and disturbed spirit to ultimately not be heeded. In the Old Testament, wisdom gets personified as a woman in the book of Proverbs, and she gets treated like a prophet who is often not heeded. She warns, but her counsel is overlooked, and violence, death, and destruction follow in its wake. Matthew's author creates an echo of Lady Wisdom and prophetess through Pilate's wife. It makes me wonder, if Pilate's wife had been listened to, is there a reality where Jesus did not have to die such a violent death? As we talked about in a previous message from one of Fuller Seminary's chaplains, when the women live, everybody lives. I would reaffirm this based on today's message, that the wisdom of women leads to life. Through the different accounts of Jesus' trial under Pilate in the Gospels, we can gather that Pilate was uneasy about the trial and the decision. Prior to this trial, Pilate had provoked and caused multiple riots and demonstration from the Jews due to the ways he had flagrantly used symbols throughout Judea to show Caesar as divine. Another political upheaval would have been dangerous for Pilate's Roman political career, and it could cost him his life. Further riot could have been possible with the Jewish priests' hatred for Jesus and the eventual presence of a crowd. But despite this, Pilate still questions the need for Jesus to be on trial. Pilate knew that Jesus was turned over by the chief priests because of their jealousy and fear of losing power. In Mark, Pilate questions the priests' accusations, showing them that Jesus has committed no crimes. In John, he asserts Jesus' innocence and is afraid of the consequences of condemning this holy man, who has been called both King of the Jews and Son of God. Yet none of these things make him heed the words of his wife, other than washing his hands and pretending that he had no agency in this moment. Yes, Pilate's wife could have simply been trying to warn her husband to have nothing to do with Jesus in order to protect their own lives and protect them from a potential riot. But in that case, she would have no need to affirm that Jesus was a righteous man. Pilate avoids a riot by giving the priests what they want. Affirming Jesus was righteous would not have done so. So, though she remains nameless, she does not remain silent. Pilate's wife creates agency and decides to speak up, even though she is in a system that only allows her proximity to power. Even if she becomes God's mouthpiece or a herald of wisdom, her words do not grant her any decision-making power. Instead, her words are used to only affirm Jesus' innocence in the story of his trial and death. Pilate realizes Jesus' innocence, but ultimately passes the buck and lets the Jewish priests and crowd decide. He washes his hands of his responsibility. However, Pilate's wife, in my imagination, received this dream and chooses to wake and send urgent word to her husband in the middle of a political act of judgment. She is willing to disrupt the status quo to be heard. It almost feels like her action is taking responsibility on behalf of innocence when those around with the power decide to stay passive or choose a scapegoat. Pilate's wife becomes an example of God choosing women as God's mouthpiece, and also the need to take swift responsibility when you have the opportunity to speak out against injustice. Yes, the character of Pilate's wife could be seen as nothing more than a plot tool. She could just be a literary device used by the author of Matthew to affirm to the Jewish reader of their guilt and blame for the death of an innocent Christ. Just like the other nameless women in the Gospels, Pilate's wife could just be there as a prop for the men of the story. It is hard to say, but I would like to read it differently. I think that if we use our theological imagination to give her a voice, even if we cannot give her a name, we can hear her story as a parable. We can hear her story as another example of women taking agency within patriarchal, male-centered systems that want women to be nameless and voiceless. This is in line with the early church, as many early theologians and writers have chosen to identify and be curious about her story. The early church ascribed her meaning. In some Eastern Orthodox traditions, she is even given sainthood and feast days where her life and actions are celebrated. The story of Pilate's wife teaches me, as a woman, that proximity to power is not the same thing as power. No matter how much proximity to power you have, in a patriarchal system, you are always in a man's world and are invisible until a man says you aren't. In a patriarchal system, we are defined by the men in our life. Even God gets assigned the names of men, such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, instead of the God of Hagar, Rahab, and Deborah, or the God of Miriam, Hannah, and Tamar, or the God of Ruth, Abigail, and Esther. Something that always bothered me is one of the ways that is used to deter men from forms of abuse towards women, or to help them empathize with female victims. They do this by reminding them that a woman is someone's daughter, someone's mother, or someone's sister, as if her existence herself as a human isn't enough to make her worthy of empathy and protection. In male-centered worlds, women become unnamed props to male narratives. In this passage in Matthew, the men get to decide everything. From the author to Pilate to the priests who get the crowd to choose Barabbas. Yet even in the patriarchal system, we get a glimpse of women seizing agency when they weren't designed to have any. Pilate's wife is one woman choosing to use her voice as a potential vessel for God's words, or at the least, a woman with a sense of intuition, wisdom, and discernment. Women have always had to count the cost on whether they should speak up or against a system that does not include them or empower them. Though the risk might not have been as high for Pilate's wife, the story reminds me of Esther, or even the two women who Carl and Glenn have shared so far. In all of the stories we have shared, the women have had to walk into a place where they didn't belong and advocate for what was deserved. As I'm sure most of us have felt, any space where we have to prove our right to exist is a violent space. Despite this, in each story, the women choose agency for liberation. The women choose agency for liberation. For they know in their gut that liberation requires disruption, that there is no liberation without interruption. I hope as a community that we can embody this. Whether we have a little power or a lot, or even just proximity to power, I hope that, like Pilate's wife, our dreams will be that of justice for others, and that we will call ourselves to stop participating in unjust systems. I hope that we will take on the responsibility of others' liberation, even if they are nothing like us. I pray that, like women everywhere, we will risk speaking up and advocating for truth and asking those in power to protect the innocent. The voices of women bring life. May we continue to bring life to women in return by knowing their stories and their names and honor those who are left nameless. May we continue to recognize the God of Hagar, Ruth, and Esther in the names of women. Just like Mary Magdalene, who immediately recognized the risen Christ by the sound of her very own name. Thank you.